On today's World Insight, China's reform and opening up has generated wealth. How can China ensure that this wealth is equally distributed? And the latest numbers on the Chinese economy. A well-respected American economist helps us make sense of the numbers from his courtyard in Beijing. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Common prosperity, the catchword in a recent high-level meeting chaired by Chinese President Xi Jinping. Participants discussed plans to achieve that goal along with financial stability and development strategies. The meeting resulted in a decision that China will stick to a people-centered development path while balancing the relationship between efficiency and fairness. There was also going to be the pledge to strengthen market-based principles and law-based governance, along with efforts to prevent major financial crises. So what does common prosperity really mean, and how does China plan to achieve it? Let's ask our panelists. For more on this, joining us in Washington, D.C., Yukong Huang, Senior Associate in the Carnegie Asia Program. In Singapore, Professor Bert Hoffman, Director of the East Asian Institute at National University of Singapore. Former World Bank Country Director for China, Korea, and Mongolia. In Shanghai, Wang Dan, Chief Economist of Hang Seng Bank. And in Shenzhen, last but not least, Xiao Geng, Director of the Institute of Policy and Practice of Shenzhen Finance Institute from Chinese University of Hong Kong. Wonderful to see every one of you, ladies and gentlemen. This is an important topic. Well, a lot of things are going on in the world. China is focusing on equality. So I think that's a common prosperity, the catchword is. How do you see the emphasis on this word? Mr. Xiao.
Well, I think China in the last 40 years has to, go to the market economy and opening up. So a lot of people get rich, and the economy also, grows in scale. And a lot of things are really doing well, but one thing common to every other country is the inequality. So this is the right time, to really focus on how to solve the common problem for every country. And I think China set the target many years ago, but now really start to implement it.
Ms. Wang, do you see it that way from the financial service sector?
Well, I think in practical terms, it means equal access to financial services, to education and healthcare. And right now, it seems that the biggest problem is that though on average, everyone's income and wealth is improving, rich people's income and wealth is accumulating a lot faster than low-income people. So how do we really increase the income for the lowest bracket, the 20%, or the lowest 20% is the biggest challenge.
So it seems that to both of you, it is an important message. The question is how. Mr. Huang, do you see it that way?
I think it's certainly a key question that policymakers in China need to address at this moment in time. When I look at China's experience over the last 20, 30 years, I'm struck by two particular statistics. One is that personal incomes have increased by about 10% a year, every year for decades. So everyone's gotten a lot better off, and that's extraordinary. At the same time, the measurements of inequality have soared. So inequality has soared. So this particular moment in time, the question is, can you maintain rapid growth so that everyone's lives are better, and at the same time moderate growing inequality? And I think there's ways of doing that. But I would stress that the concept of equality has many aspects. I would say that most societies, what's really important is equality of opportunities. And that's what you've seen in China over the last several decades. People have found jobs, they moved around, they've gone in different. As a consequence, incomes have soared. So it's also very important to keep in mind that we're not just thinking about equality of outcomes, but equality of opportunities to join what I call a more prosperous society.
Means and results. Professor Hoffman, what about for you, that catchword?
On the positive side, China's inequality has actually, income inequality has actually come down ever since 2011 when it peaked. It came down in the national statistics. It came down a little bit from the Gini coefficient, a measure for inequality. It came down from 48 to 45. What is still rising is wealth inequality. And I think that is in part the concern that happens in the West. There's a lot of talk about wealth inequality. And during the COVID crisis, even the wealthier people became more wealthier because their shares got up in price. China is like any country, has a higher inequality in wealth than in income. The Gini coefficient for wealth is about 70, but it's not as unequal as, say, the United States or even my country, the Netherlands, where it is 90. It's comparable to a bit higher than Korea and Japan. Clearly, there are concerns with inequality, and one of the concerns is that rich people have more influence on policy making and then make policies that continue to be good for rich people. So Deng Xiaoping saying people may get rich first and then need to help others to get rich too, I think that's the most concern, and that relates to Professor Huang's note on equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcomes.
Well, this is one part of it. The other part of the discussion about the latest policy direction is what's going to happen to those who are already become relatively richer than the other parts of the population. For example, the private sector, for example, the tech sector, and many of those individuals that are flourishing over the past decades during the reform and opening up. What kind of process is this likely to be for them? Professor Xiao, I want to knock on your door first about, you're based in Shenzhen. That's where a lot of things are happening. Prosperity, you see that. How do people there read the latest messages?
Well, I think for people in Shenzhen, the key message is that the government is going to spend a lot of resources to help, the housing and also education infrastructure. This is the main message, and in fact, Shenzhen has already started this process, and Shenzhen is actually trying to learn from Singapore and in a way also Hong Kong, to provide the housing to the low-income people. The Shenzhen is really encouraging innovation, and a lot of companies, private companies, they actually emerge in Shenzhen really by planning, So I think here people is commonly, in the sense that they understand the government would continue to keep opening and also keep the market forces.
Professor Hoffman, how do you see the example of Shenzhen and some of the other places, so-called, and also the individuals, that 20% of Chinese population are actually earning more than 10 times than the rest of the population? How do you see this divide, and what does that mean for that 20% also?
I'd like to repeat Yukon Huang's words that actually over the past 10 years, the bottom 40% has gained more than the top 10%. So their incomes are actually rising more rapidly. But in some areas, such as Shenzhen, it becomes very difficult to live because it's so expensive, and people would have to, in a way, have job opportunities elsewhere. Some of the more traditional work that is happening in Shenzhen maybe has to move elsewhere. At the same time, there is a risk that these debates, and they happened in the 60s and the 70s in the West, and frankly, at some point the income taxes and even wealth taxes became so high that it became a clear disincentive for people to work hard. And you saw a lot of capital flight. You saw big entrepreneurs all moving to Monaco. That was the place to go because they had very low income tax. So those are things to take into account into this debate as well.
Ms. Wang.
So I think we need to also realize that reducing inequality and reducing poverty are very two different things. And for a lot of the rich people in a wealthier class, many of them are entrepreneurs, and they should be rewarded for the hard work and innovation that they have done. But right now, it just seems that we don't have a mechanism in place that will guarantee equal access, especially to the financial services. And when we look at the post-COVID world, it is the most difficult time for small, medium enterprises, and it's even harder for them to borrow and stay alive. So that is probably the most pressing issue in the next decade.
Professor Huang.
I'd like to make an observation about why it is we see such extreme inequality and why has it been increasing so much more rapidly, let's say, in the last decade or two compared to the past. And in one sense, it's because innovation, entrepreneurial initiatives create a lot more income and wealth more rapidly today than it used to. And that is because we actually have a globalized world. So if you have talent somewhere, whether in the United States or China or in Europe, your market no longer is the local market, it's become global. So the earnings that you accrue become much bigger than they would have been, let's say, 50 years ago. And then in China, you have a special factor. You can actually make or become quite wealthy in China without becoming global, because China's market, internal market, is so large. And that's why you see the rise of so many billionaires in China over the last 10 or 20 years. So if you have a lot of entrepreneurial spirit and you hit the right kinds of activities, your gains are enormous. And then the question is this good or bad? And I would argue that a lot of this is quite good, of course, because it generates jobs, it generates activities, it spurs money to new kinds of investments, and that's good for growth. And China's growing faster because of this. But then you have this inequality. And as Bert Hoffman mentioned, you have a wealth problem. So I think the key issue in terms of this inequality issue is how do you tax or how do you moderate the rapid increase in wealth that accrues to individuals because of entrepreneurial innovative talents? And you don't want to discourage that activity, but you also should we all recognize that some of that is excessive. And society needs to make use of it in a better way. Otherwise, you're going to have what I would call a lot of pressure on on society in general.
Professor Zhao, agree?
Yes, I think this is the key for China. The tax system actually is already very progressive. I think the key is really to focus on how to allow the low-income people, a lot of people who can really have a decent living standards, and so they can really increase their productivity. And I think another important point is that those big companies and entrepreneurs, they already started to voluntarily really to do charity, and also contribute to some development. And this is really good because then you motivate the market forces to solve, the poverty alleviation and also some of the social welfare, issue, which is really a trend globally. And I also want to point out, I actually agree with Bert. I looked at the data. Actually, China's Gini is doing better than the United States. China is actually declining, and the U.S. is increasing. So I think this global context is actually quite important because China really now are, in the global village. And how China solves this, inequality problem is really important.
But Professor Xiao, many would argue, if I just quickly follow up, is the U.S. a good place to compare with, given how divided the politics is, how much problem it's having right now, compared to the other economies even? Professor Xiao?
I think yes, because this is the number one, number two economy, and has very different political social systems. and they are learning from each other in the economy. But on social issues, they really represent two different approaches.
Professor Huang, we see that governments around the world have been working on the huge multilateral companies that are even bigger than some of the national economies in the world. And we see higher taxes, we see more scrutiny of policies, and we also see more scrutiny of the founders and their practices. How do you see the global context of that, and how do you put China in that global context?
We have this is actually a very current issue in the sense that there's a movement to look at and regulate corporate tax rates globally. You have a problem here. Countries believe that multinational companies, particularly ones which are very profitable, that they should be fairly taxed or taxed at least significantly enough to make a difference in terms of generating wealth for our countries. But if you tax your corporations more than other countries are, then companies move, they relocate. So now you see a global discussion about should there be a minimum global corporate income tax. So I think that's one aspect of the problem, to make sure that corporations pay their relative share. But I think that there's the other aspect, because ultimately that money flows to individuals. Mm-hmm. And is when that money flows to individuals, and some have incredible wealth, that becomes a wealth issue. So you have someone like Bill Gates of Microsoft, and what does he think the solution is? Well, he's a great example. He makes a lot of money and he generates a lot of innovation. He also ends up with billions and billions of dollars. And the solution in his particular case, he realizes he's better off giving it away to society. So in the U.S., you're moving to a situation where the concept is make as much money as you can, because that's innovation, entrepreneurship, but somehow pay it somehow to society, because our tax systems don't do this. So can you voluntarily do this through charitable institutions is actually a big issue in the United States now.
We see measures and policies, Ms. Wang, in the sectors of high-tech platforms, for example, education, as well as healthcare and some of the other sectors in China. The policies have been very intense over the past few weeks, and many people relate what's going on then to the latest discussion about common prosperity. Ms. Wang, do you make that link?
I can see a fundamental link there, because when we talk about China's inequality issues, inequality in the background, especially in education, is the key. And right now, the income growth is still pretty fast. So the lower income graduate people in that group actually have hope. But the social mobility is going down. And that's similar to the case in the US or even in Europe. And that can eventually become a really serious problem. And I can see that the cracking down of the education platform has caused a lot of unemployment and unhappiness among many of the employees. But that probably is one of the things that a regulator have to do. Is eventually, to increase social mobility, education is probably the easiest access to start with.
Is that the right way?
I think it is the only way.
Okay. Professor Hoffman.
I think the big driver for equality still comes from the expenditure side, and investment in education, investing in public housing, investing in the health system can be structured to be very equalizing and to give more equality of opportunity. But at the same time, there are specific measures that the government could take and has been debating that would give a more equal burden on the revenue side. The capital gains tax I mentioned. Some in the West talk about wealth taxation, broad wealth taxation. It used to be quite popular in the 70s and 80s. It went a little bit out of fashion, but now people say maybe we should reintroduce that. But there's other ways of having a broader, a much broad-based income tax to finance all the burdens that come to China.
Professor Huang, do you see the latest as minor adjustment of directions in terms of how China's economy is likely to approach and how the distribution system is going to be done? or this is clear message of a important shift of directions? As you may know, these two are very different.
First of all, let me emphasize that I agree fully with Professor Hoffman's comments about what China is weak at, and its tax and social distribution systems could be strengthened. Focus on wealth taxes or some form of wealth taxes, capital gains, property taxes, assets, could also be looked at. But I think from a Washington perspective, what is really driving the markets and concerns are signals, intentional, unintentional, which suggest government policies are likely to be reining in the activities of major internet companies and innovative companies that generate certain kinds of activities through equity markets, floating of shares, and other kinds of activities. And it's a bit ambiguous. And some of that signal that comes out is a signal which says too much money is going to those activities, too many people are getting wealthy, and this is not China's interest in the long term. And by the way, this is not an issue particular just to China. There's also concern in the US about the fact that major innovative companies dominate the markets, that they have monopoly earnings, and they need to be strongly regulated. So this is actually a concern, not just in China, but also in the United States, also emerging in Europe. But it's also a signal about the fact that many of what I call the wealth creation is occurring in certain kinds of activities. And the debate then becomes, should we discourage people going into those activities? Should we discourage money to go? Should we discourage our youth from entering into those sectors? And I think that's a very serious issue, because then the question, I don't want to disturb what I call entrepreneurial innovative activities, but you also have bearing in mind the social, what I call the social objectives of a country, that is the development of those activities in the country's interests. That's a big issue.
All right. Professor Xiao?
Well, I actually don't think this is a major shift. I see a lot of continuities. And the major change is really serious implementation. And here, I think there are actually some problems in terms of communication and also the timing, particularly important in the sense that China is a country with very strong central government, and the market forces are not really as strong as other places. So I think for me, I hope this is really a continuation of China's 40 years of reform. It's just the acceleration in terms of the common prosperity.
Okay.
I don't see any major change in the long-term development.
Right. My final question, but it's also an important one. In this process, the goal for common prosperity, how much role will the state have, and how much role will the societies and other sectors have? That's, of course, a very interesting question. On that, I also want to invite your opinions briefly, maybe. We'll leave it to other times also to discuss. Ms. Wang.
So I think the state would play an equally important role as a society, because there has to be government guidance and there has to be affordable housing backed by the state. But when it comes to innovation, to increase the income for poor people, it has to be based on a market economy, and the private sector will play a key role.
I see.
So in the end, we have to see it as a dynamic problem.
Professor Hoffman.
Well, look, the experience is that beyond the level of income that China is now, that the state will grow. And there is lots of expenditures to be done. If you just look at the aging problem, what the implications for healthcare and the implications for long-term care and the implications for pension, that would add 7 to 10 percentage point of GDP in public spending over the next 30 years. So just that will drive up the influence of the state. But the question is then, okay, so how do you raise the revenues for that? And how do you continue to have a thriving economy that can actually carry that burden? So my answer would be that you need to continue to reform to get more efficiency out of that economy, and be careful with some of the regulation that might kill the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Professor Xiao.
Yeah, I think the state and the market should complement each other, and they both should grow.
Okay, Professor Huang, last but not least.
Well, I would just make the observation that China is moving from what I call upper middle income country to what I call developed country, high income status. And this particular issue reflects the tensions during that transition. So you're dealing with the fact that for China to continue to grow, it must be more innovative, more entrepreneurial. It can't count upon the policies of the past to grow. At the same time, you have now inequality showing up in incomes and wealth. And that's a reflection of the fact that it's been so successful. So this is the key issue. How does it manage the transition to a more innovative economy, at the same time manage these tensions that relate to inequalities in income and wealth?
Thank you everyone for your wonderful contribution. I learned so much. Really appreciate it. Yukong Huang, Bert Hoffman, Xiao Gang, last but not least, Wang Dan. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight. Coming up, a closer look at the state of the Chinese economy with an American economist who talked to me at his picturesque hutong place in Beijing. He spoke with years of experiences observing and analyzing China from within. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. How is China's economy doing? Data tells us in July, China's inflation measured with the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, rose by 1% year on year. Rising CPI traditionally suggests worsening inflation, but things are different this time. Meanwhile, on the trade side, export growth slowed in July to 19.3% growth rate, which is attributed to the Delta-led resurgence of COVID-19 cases worldwide. So, what's the outlook on the Chinese economy for the rest of 2021? I asked Michael Pettis, a well-respected American economist, at his Hutong office in the heart of Beijing. Professor Pettis, what a pleasure to see you once again.
It's a pleasure to see you, Tian Wei.
Living in the middle of downtown Beijing, I'm sure you have a real sense of how the Chinese economy is doing. What are your neighbors saying?
Well, I have a sense of how this part of Beijing is doing, and it seems to be doing pretty lively.
Yeah, like what?
Lots of people are out, although I've noticed that in recent days, once again, more people are wearing masks and more people are checking your phones before they let you into the shops, etc. So I guess we're going through a little bit of a resurgence, which I hope will end fairly soon.
But right opposite, not far from your place, is exactly the bar place of Beijing, huh? Were people still consuming before this round of Delta variant concern?
Yeah, many of the places were quite full. And, you know, I work a lot with musicians, and they've been doing tours that have almost all sold out. So for a while, things were going very well. I think already we're starting to get cancellations because of the Delta variant. So we're all hoping that that's no more than a few weeks, and then we go back to normal.
Well, you could argue Beijing might not be typical in terms of, the Chinese economy as a whole, but this could tell a little bit story about how much drive is there for consumption among the common Chinese folks.
Well, the problem is not that the Chinese people don't like to consume. They do, and in fact, among young Chinese, there's a concern that consumption levels may be too high. The problem that China faces is not so much that people won't consume, but rather that people retain a low share of what they produce. So in the US, for example, if you produce 100 kwai worth of goods, typically you get directly or indirectly about 80. And in Europe, you might get 70, 75. In Japan, you might get around 60. In China, you get around 50. And as a result, you can't consume a large share of what you produce. And that's the consumption problem in China.
That's one thing. The other thing is about how much are the Chinese households spending every month, for example, and what are the percentage? Many argue a huge percentage being devoted to the children's education. And you see that as the reason why the government comes out with a new regulation to crack down on the high-tech educational firms. Do you think it's working so far?
Well, you know, spending money on your children's education is part of consumption. So when you crack down on that sector, what you're hoping to do is to divert money from that sector to go into other consumption sectors. My understanding of the crackdown is because they're very concerned about the impact on inequality. The problem, as you know, in China is that if you're rich, you can afford to send your kids to much better training to do well in the Gaokou to get into a top university. And I think they're trying to break that because there's other measures too that they're implementing to try to make it a bit more egalitarian.
You mentioned egalitarian. It seems that word is being emphasized once again together with fairness. That has a lot to do with some of the recent policies. How much do you think the policies in the middle and long term will be able to address these issues?
It's an important question, not just for China. Inequality has become, in many ways, one of the biggest economic problems in the world. We see very high levels everywhere. And in principle, we know how to resolve it. It's quite easy. It's you transfer income from those who have a disproportionate share to those who have a low share. It's easy to say, but it's politically always very tough to do because the groups that have a disproportionate share of income, of course, are politically very powerful. So what they want is the transfers to be borne by other groups. And it's very difficult to resolve that. But the good news is that really in the last 2 to 3 years, really in China, in the US and other countries, we've been talking very seriously about inequality as a really big problem for domestic demand. And I'm hoping that countries, they'll use different steps, but they'll move in the direction of redistributing income.
However, investors, as you may know very well, many of them you are working with on a daily basis, are having concerns about what to do with the China market. On the one hand, they understand the size and the potential of this market. On the other side, they do not understand the step-by-step daily changes going on. How do you see that?
Well, there's a very big learning process.
For your two?
For all of us, because we haven't really seen this before. Remember, China had pretty strict capital controls for most of its modern history. And it's only in the last few years that they've started to eliminate the capital controls. So foreign investment in China is still very low compared to other developing countries and certainly compared to other advanced economies. But it's growing very, very quickly. And what we recently had in the last 2 weeks was a really big shock to foreign investors because they were not used to those types of policies being implemented by the government. So everyone's pulled back and they're sort of rethinking their strategies and they're trying to get a deeper understanding of what are the risks that you have to be concerned of when you invest in China.
We've been talking to different walks of life to understand, particularly for our audience from outside, to understand what's going on. For example, we talked to the national security expert, and he has been suggesting that many have not noticed the dramatic change that China has put in its national plan, that development and national security become the two sole most important issues. So what we're seeing right now is the daily step-by-step adjusting toward those goals. Right. Your take?
Right. Well, it's important because since the reform and opening up, China's followed a very different strategy. And as it's followed that strategy, investors have become used to that strategy of continual opening up. Refocusing domestically on national development and on security issues is for most, not just foreigners, but also many Chinese investors, a very new refocus. And you know, that's going to require institutional changes. And in such a big, complex economy like China, it's really hard to predict what those changes, how they're going to affect the markets. So basically, you learn by doing, by making mistakes. And I think that has a lot of investors nervous.
Because people were saying, oh, first of all, it's maybe and financial, and then there's DD, and then there's computer games, and who knows what's next. You will hear commentators in some of the international business media outlets would say things like that. So as a seasoned analyst, how do you see comments like this, and what is your best advice?
My best advice is that if you want to invest in Chinese stocks, you have to be ready for a lot of volatility. And this is not new. Volatility has been enormous for years and years. And the volatility is not necessarily driven for fundamental reasons. In fact, it's almost never driven for fundamental reasons. It's driven for liquidity reasons, political reasons, things like that. You have to learn that system. The bond markets are quite different, or at least the government bond market, because the Chinese government bond is extremely high credit quality. And so all you have to care about is the interest rate and the currency. And I think the interest rate you can see is high. And I think it's pretty safe to say that the currency will be stable or strong for the next few years. I don't see a lot of weakness there.
The other thing is about the Central Economic Forum that just wrapped up a few days ago. What do you see as the most important policy lines in that statement?
Well, to me, there's this real undercurrent of debate taking place in China about the economy. And you can broadly break it up into two groups. One group is very worried about the rise in debt. So you get these constant references by the central bank, by the banking regulators, the CBIRC, and by other people on the regulatory side who are warning about the need to bring debt under control. The other group is very worried about slowing growth, and so they're warning that we need to keep stepping on the accelerator and speed growth up. Now, the problem is that those are two completely conflicting strategies. You cannot, without a growth in debt, growth in China, economic growth in China probably wouldn't be more than 2 to 3%. So if you want growth rates higher than that, you need the debt burden to get worse. If you want the debt burden to stop getting worse, you have to accept lower growth rates than that. And I don't think that debate has been resolved. I think that there still is a great deal of argument about that. I think for now, those who are more concerned about debt have slightly the upper hand. But what we've seen in the past is that when they get the upper hand and growth starts to slow, then you get policymakers get very nervous about growth, and then you start to see debt pick up and growth pick up again. That's something that has to be resolved, and I don't think it has been resolved yet.
It did mention about carbon. Of course, many believe it could be one of those drivers. How realistic do you think people should be about that possibility?
Well, you know, the comparison is with, say, the US in World War II. War turned out to be very good for the economy. And so people say if we have a war on environmentalism, on issues of the environment, in a sense a kind of war where we spend huge amounts of money in order to beat this particular enemy, this could be really good for the economy. The problem with that thinking is that there are cases under which it's good for the economy. You have to remember that when the US entered World War II, it had gone through the biggest depression in its history. It had huge levels of unemployment and huge levels of unutilized resources. And so it was able to transfer all of that towards the war without significantly undermining the economy. China doesn't have a huge amount of unutilized capacity, doesn't have high levels of unemployment. So a serious environmental fight might actually also, in the short term, reduce the growth rate. In the long term, it would be good for everybody. But in the short term, it could have adverse economic consequences.
So what we're having now is a lot of things at different directions, right? You've got the geopolitics, you've got the pandemic, you've got people thinking about what's going to be the future driver of the economy, carbon, for example. So how do you see the policymakers in China are trying to reconcile all of these possibilities, and how do you read the final statement, for example, for the latter half of the year on the economic conference?
You can't even predict COVID. And if you can't predict COVID, you can't predict anything else. And so even if that were the only problem, it would be a mess. But it's not the only problem. There's lots of other problems, and it's very, very hard to figure out which way to go.
Moving on to the China-US relations, you've been working on analyzing the Chinese economy, China-US trade for a long time. How do you read the future for the rest of the year, at least, in terms of China-US trade interactions?
Well,
we got some beautiful birds chirping. Yes. I hope it's a good sign.
Well, that should be good for the interview, right? Chirping yes. Birds. The issue for trade, I think, is there are two important points that I would make. The first point is that everybody looks at the US-China conflict because it's the best show in town. It's the most exciting show. But I think it's a really big mistake to see this global problem as a U.S.-China conflict. As I see it, there are conflicts all over. There are, within Latin America, within North America, in Europe, in China, among Chinese neighbors, etc. There's a lot of conflict. And I think that this shouldn't come as a surprise. In my 2013 book, I said this had to happen. As we were in a period of what Danny Roderick calls hyperglobalization, we were going to start to see a retreat from that as the costs of globalization mounted, one of which is this severe income inequality. And as we retreat from it, historically, global political tensions always rise. And so I'm not surprised that they've risen, and I don't think they're going to go away. I think it would be useful if we placed less attention on the US-China relationship and just recognize that we have bad relationships. Everybody has bad relationships with everybody right now. It's really, really difficult to see how this gets resolved quickly. And I don't think it's going away. I think we have at least 2 or 3 more years of geopolitical tensions, of unhappiness.
A conversation on the Chinese economy. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more Search World Insight, check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.